What would you do if the person you trusted most, your own wife, secretly took everything your family left behind? She thought she was clever, that I'd never notice. But what she didn't realize was that I had seen this coming long before she made her move. My name is Adrian Cole, and I learned the hard way that sometimes the person closest to you is the one holding the knife. It was a rainy Thursday when I got the call. My father had passed. He had been battling illness for a while, but nothing prepares you for the finality of those words. I sat motionless on the edge of our bed, phone still in hand, the dull hum of the rain tapping against the windows. Cassandra, my wife of 6 years, walked in, saw the look on my face, and said nothing, just nodded solemnly, turned and walked out. I remember thinking it was strange, how detached she seemed. But grief does strange things to people, right? At least, that's what I told myself. That day, a piece of me died with my father. But I had no idea another part of my life had already begun to rot from the inside. What followed were endless calls with lawyers, long nights reading through my father's instructions, and meetings with the estate executor. My father had left behind a modest empire, 2 properties, a healthy investment portfolio, and a lump sum of cash. I was his only child, and the will made it explicitly clear, everything was meant for me. Cassandra appeared supportive, even helpful. She took over handling condolence messages, kept the house running, and gave me space. But now, looking back, I realized that was the moment she started making her moves. My father wasn't born into wealth. He built it brick by brick, first with a small hardware store, then with smart investments in commercial real estate. I grew up watching him work late into the night, pencil behind his ear, balancing ledgers while my mother brought him coffee. He taught me everything I knew about value, of money, of people, of silence. When he passed, his attorney handed me a letter written in my father's own hand. "Don't just inherit my wealth, son," it read. "Inherit my eyes. Not everyone around you is who they say they are." At the time, I assumed it was just the sentiment of a man nearing the end. But now I know he had a reason for those words. He knew something about Cassandra, or at least, he suspected. The will was straightforward. Everything he owned, his house in Maine, the shares in 3 commercial buildings, the investment accounts, were transferred into my name. Cassandra was cordial at first, maybe even a little distant. She didn't argue or ask questions, just nodded whenever I updated her on the process. I mistook her silence for grace, for understanding. But in truth, she was biding her time. She saw my grief as her opportunity, and while I was burying my father, she was already digging through what he left behind, searching for cracks, for access, for leverage. And I, blind with mourning, handed her the keys without even realizing it. Cassandra was magnetic. That's the only way I can describe her when we met. She had a smile that could pull focus in any room and a confidence that wrapped itself around you like silk. I was working late nights at a consulting firm when she walked into my life. Sharp suit, sharper wit, and eyes that didn't just look at you, but through you. We moved fast. Within a year, we were married. She made everything feel like it had direction, as though life finally had color and tempo. My friends called her intense. My mother said she was too polished. But I was already in too deep to see it. I wasn't marrying a stranger. I was marrying ambition dressed in elegance. Over time, little things began to surface. Cassandra was never interested in my side of the family. She didn't care much for my father or the legacy he was building. She found small ways to isolate us from him, claimed he was too opinionated, too controlling. I mistook her complaints for loyalty to me, not realizing she was chipping away at the roots that tied me to my past. She was subtle, calculated. But the truth is, I let her in so completely, I never questioned how far she'd go once she was inside. It came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. My father and I had been sitting in his study, going over quarterly numbers from one of his rental properties. He looked up suddenly and said, "Son, Make sure you keep business and marriage separate. It's not that I don't trust her, it's that I don't trust anyone who wants your attention more than your character." I laughed it off, thinking he was being overly cautious, a bit old-fashioned maybe. Cassandra had always been respectful in front of him, never overstepped. But he was a man who had built trust over time, and something about her didn't sit right with him. That was the first and only time he ever said anything negative about her. I brushed it aside, believing I knew her better than anyone else. But now, with everything that's happened, I realized that was the first flare. Subtle, but enough. He saw something I couldn't. Not because I was blind, but because I chose not to look. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't arrive in a storm. It tiptoes in while you're smiling, dressed as the person you love most. After my father passed, Cassandra's attentiveness ramped up. She made my favorite meals, scheduled all our appointments, even helped draft condolence messages for extended family. On the surface, it felt like love. In reality, it was a smokescreen. I later realized this is exactly when she began asking questions. Innocent ones, framed with concern. Are the accounts in your name now? Do we need a financial planner to help manage the estate? Should I help you organize the paperwork? At the time, I welcomed the help. I was emotionally drained, and she seemed like the perfect partner. But her curiosity had a pattern. She only asked about things she could potentially access: account names, property deeds, asset locations. She never brought it all up at once, always sprinkled the questions into everyday conversations. It didn't trigger any alarm bells at the time. If anything, it felt like she cared. But now I see the truth. Her smile wasn't comfort, it was cover. She wasn't offering to help carry the weight of my father's legacy. She was quietly weighing how much of it she could carry away for herself. The first real crack appeared 6 weeks after the inheritance cleared. I was organizing some financial statements when I noticed a transfer, small, but out of place. A wire of $4,000 had been moved from one of the investment accounts into a joint savings account we never used. I couldn't remember authorizing it. I assumed it was a bank error and called the institution. They confirmed the request came from our home IP address. I checked with Cassandra casually. She shrugged, said it must have been a mistake, and offered to look into it. But she never did. A few days passed. Then I caught her logging into that joint account from her tablet, and when she saw me notice, she quickly closed it. That was the moment something shifted inside me. It wasn't about the money, it was the ease with which she lied. No hesitation, I didn't confront her right away. Just a smooth pivot. Instead, I started watching. Tracking. I needed to know if this was a one-time thing, or the beginning of something much darker. 2 weeks later, I set up monitoring on all our shared accounts. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. That's when I saw it, a $25,000 transfer to an unknown business entity labeled Goldfinch Holdings. It wasn't one of my father's companies, and it certainly wasn't anything I had authorized. I checked the account again and saw it was withdrawn from a high-yield portfolio I hadn't touched. That money had been meant for long-term reinvestment, one of the key pillars of my father's portfolio strategy. When I asked Cassandra about it, she feigned ignorance. "Maybe your dad set that up before he passed," she offered. But her tone was too controlled, too polished. My gut screamed otherwise. I started digging into Goldfinch Holdings, and discovered it was a shell company. And then, like a slap to the face, I saw her name on one of the subsidiary filings, Cassandra W. Alden, listed as managing director. That's when it hit me, this wasn't just about access. She had planned something for months, maybe even years. The woman I married wasn't just opportunistic. She was orchestrating a quiet theft from under my nose. I went to see my father's lawyer, Martin Hale, a man I'd known since I was a teenager. He'd handled every legal detail of my father's estate and was one of the few people I still trusted. I told him about the missing funds, the strange business transaction, and Cassandra's name on the shell company. He listened without interrupting, brows drawn together in concern. Then, after a pause, he leaned forward and asked a question that chilled me. "Are you sure you didn't give her power of attorney?" I shook my head immediately, but I wasn't certain. There had been so many documents, so many signatures. Could she have slipped something in during one of those early days? Martin grew quiet. "You need to check every signature, every account authorization. If she's done what I think she has, she may have created a legal pathway to your assets." That's when it all became real. This wasn't just emotional betrayal, it was financial warfare. He promised to look into the company filings and pull up anything linked to my accounts. But I could tell even he was shaken. He'd known Cassandra too, thought she was poised, intelligent. Neither of us had seen this side of her coming. And if Martin, with all his legal foresight, had hesitated, then she had covered her tracks well. The days that followed felt like drowning in slow motion. Every hour brought a new discovery. Funds moved without my knowledge, joint accounts suddenly closed, assets frozen or rerouted. The number kept growing. 45,000. Then 60. Then 80. I started piecing together a ledger of the missing money, and it became clear. Cassandra had been draining the estate methodically. She hadn't taken it all at once. That would have drawn attention. Instead, she carved away at it like a sculptor, shaving just enough here, trimming there, never enough to set off alarms, but always enough to grow her escape fund. When I confronted her again, this time with the numbers, she didn't deny anything. She just tilted her head and said, "It was never really yours to begin with. It's your father's money. And you would have wasted it on sentiment." That sentence broke something in me. The woman I had shared my life with didn't just steal from me, she resented what I represented. Everything my father had worked for, everything he wanted to pass down to me, she saw as disposable. I realized then that trust wasn't just broken. It was incinerated. And I couldn't put the pieces back, not this time. The confession didn't come during a fight. It came during dinner. Calm, calculated. She had poured herself a glass of wine, plated our meal like nothing was wrong, and then casually dropped the bomb between bites of salmon. "You know, I started moving the money right after your dad got sick," she said. "I figured you'd be too busy grieving to notice." And I was right. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, just chewed her food and waited for me to react. It was surreal, watching her admit, so easily, that she'd betrayed me long before my father had even passed. I stared at her, waiting for some kind of emotion to break through. Regret, guilt, even anger. But there was nothing. She went on to explain how she'd set up the accounts, the dummy corporation, and even recruited a friend to help forge minor authorizations. She said it all like she was explaining a business plan, not a scheme that gutted everything I thought we had. She believed it was over, that I was defeated. But what she didn't realize was that she had just handed me the final piece I needed. Her arrogance had loosened her grip, and I was about to show her exactly what my father's final lesson had taught me. It wasn't a fight. She didn't scream or cry. Cassandra simply stood up from the table, grabbed her already packed designer handbag, and walked toward the door. She paused only once, to glance at the photo of my father on the hallway shelf. "He never liked me, you know," she said. "He could always see through people." Then she left. No dramatic exit. No slamming doors. Just the sound of expensive heels clicking down the porch steps. I stood frozen in the silence she left behind, not because I missed her, but because I realized just how much of a mask she'd worn all these years. In that moment, I didn't feel rage. I felt free. Her leaving wasn't a defeat, It was a reveal. I walked into my father's study, sat in his old chair, and pulled out the documents he'd left me that she'd never seen. She thought she had taken everything. She thought she had gutted the estate. But what she never understood was that the surface wealth was never the real prize. My father's greatest lessons weren't in his money, they were in the plans he left behind. And I had followed every word. The days after she left were quiet. Too quiet. I kept to myself, cleaning up the wreckage, sorting through what was left of my accounts, my home, my life. Cassandra had left a trail of destruction, but not everything was lost. What she didn't realize was that my father and I had already anticipated something like this. When he first got sick, he'd advised me to create a separate, private financial entity, one she would never know about. We called it the contingency fund. And now, that account, tucked away offshore and in my name only, held more than half of the estate's worth. I began to rebuild. Slowly. Privately. I filed quiet legal claims, froze the rest of the assets she hadn't yet touched, and sent my father's lawyer the full timeline of what she had done. Cassandra would face consequences, not just personal, but legal. But I didn't want to win through court alone. I wanted her to feel what it was like to think she'd won, only to realize she had played herself. Because true revenge isn't about shouting from the rooftops. It's about silence so deafening it crushes the soul. The final conversation I had with my father before he passed wasn't about property, or stocks, or legal documents. It was about people. He looked me in the eye and said, "Son, always plan 2 steps ahead of your emotions. Love with your heart, but protect with your mind." At the time, I thought he was warning me about grief. I didn't understand that he was also warning me about Cassandra. He had watched her closely during his illness. Saw how she lingered too long near his file cabinet, how she was quick to volunteer for anything involving numbers or paperwork. He didn't accuse her outright, but he didn't trust her either. That lesson, vague as it had seemed back then, became my compass. I started revisiting every instruction he'd given me over the years. There were notes scribbled in the margins of ledgers, random phrases written on the back of bank statements, each one now a breadcrumb. He had seen what I didn't. He had prepared me without saying it directly. And while Cassandra was busy counting what she thought she stole, I was already assembling a quiet empire she could never touch. When Cassandra married me, she never bothered reading the updated clauses in my will. She thought everything I owned would automatically pass to her if anything happened. But what she didn't realize was that my father had insisted on a marital clause that protected generational wealth. That clause stated that any inherited asset, if not directly co-managed, would revert to a family trust in the event of betrayal, fraud, or divorce. And I had kept that clause in place, untouched, signed and sealed by both my father and his estate attorney. I updated my will 2 months after he passed, adding one final caveat. If evidence ever surfaced of financial misconduct by my spouse, all transfers would be nullified and a secondary trustee, my cousin, Ethan, would oversee redistribution. She never knew. She thought she was stealing from a man with no backup. She never imagined I had quietly removed her as beneficiary long before she made her first move. That document, resting quietly in a fireproof drawer at Hale & Pierce law firm, was the final sword. And I was ready to unsheath it. This was my ace. The account my father had set up in my name long before the inheritance even transferred. It wasn't flashy. No credit cards, no checkbook. Just a digital shell, buried beneath multiple layers of legal redirection and offshore encryption. It was created for one purpose, to be untouchable. When Cassandra thought she was draining the estate, she was targeting the accounts she could see. She had no idea that over half of my father's assets were never listed in the domestic estate files at all. I had wired the most valuable shares and dividends there during the early months of his illness, under his instruction. Cassandra thought she had taken the house, the portfolio, and the liquidity accounts. But the true legacy, his legacy, remained frozen in an untouched vault. Every time she moved a dollar, she believed it was a victory. But I was letting her play the game. Because once it ended, the only checkmate that mattered would come from a direction she never saw coming. 3 days after she left, I scheduled a private appointment at a discreet banking office just outside the city. No flashy logos, no security guards with earpieces. Just an old building with oak-paneled walls and tight-lipped professionals who dealt in confidentiality. The bank manager greeted me by name, offered his condolences for my father, and handed me a key. We walked down a narrow hallway to a private vault. Inside, everything was intact: documents, bearer bonds, international certificates of deposit, and a ledger book with my father's initials on the spine. I sat down, opened the book, and started flipping through pages. There were notes I hadn't seen before, investment patterns, offshore partnerships, even private equity opportunities one hadn't known existed. It was more than wealth. It was foresight. This wasn't just protection from people like Cassandra, it was a blueprint for rebuilding. For rising. I signed a series of forms, requested a transfer of control, and left the bank with a quiet fire in my chest. Cassandra thought she had walked out with everything. But I had just walked out with more than she ever knew existed. She hosted the party 2 weeks later. I only found out because a friend of a friend sent me the photos. Cassandra in a crimson dress, standing in front of a sleek downtown loft she claimed was a new beginning. She toasted her freedom, bragged about her new investments, smiled for pictures with her circle of designer-clad enablers. She looked like a woman who had won. But what she didn't know was that every cent she was flaunting was already under legal scrutiny. And her real losses hadn't even started. I had quietly activated every legal clause my father and I had put in place. By the time her party started, a court injunction had already been filed. Her accounts were flagged. Her name was removed from the pending trust reassignment. And Hale had sent her a letter she wouldn't receive until the next morning. She laughed and posed that night, sipping champagne she thought she'd earned. But while she was celebrating her theft, I was watching the first threads of her illusion unravel. One by one. Cassandra didn't hold back. Over the next few weeks, I watched from a distance as she upgraded her lifestyle with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed her a reward. A penthouse lease in the arts district. A luxury car with custom interiors. Spa memberships, boutique shopping sprees, even a shady startup investment with one of her smug friends. I knew exactly how much she had left. I knew how fast she was burning through it. And still, I didn't stop her. Why would I? She was digging her own grave, with receipts. The beauty of it all was that the more she spent, the more traceable the stolen money became. I had full documentation, time-stamped transfers, false authorizations, and bank account statements that tied every move back to her. She was building a paper trail in designer heels. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to pull the floor out from under her. And when I did, I wanted her to look down and realize she had nothing left to stand on. It arrived on a Wednesday morning. Cassandra was still in her new apartment, probably sipping imported coffee and wondering which overpriced lamp to buy next. The envelope was cream-colored, stamped with the Hale and Pierce insignia, and delivered by certified courier. Inside were 4 documents. The first, a formal notice of civil litigation for financial fraud and misappropriation of inheritance assets. The second, a freeze order on her remaining funds, with immediate effect. The third, a declaration that she had been removed from all estate-related trusts. And the fourth, a personal letter from me. I kept it brief. I reminded her that love isn't something you steal, and trust isn't something you sell. I told her my father had always seen her for who she truly was, and that in the end, he had protected me better than either of us realized. You thought you outplayed me, but you were never playing the real game. I don't know how she reacted. I never heard from her again. But sometimes silence is louder than a scream. In the end, the money she stole was recovered, every cent of it. The courts sided with me once the full extent of her deception was revealed. The assets were reallocated, the fraudulent companies dismantled, and her name, once etched beside mine in documents, in memories, erased from every legal tie. But more importantly, I came out the other side not just intact, but wiser. Cassandra didn't just lose access to wealth. She lost her reputation, her future, her illusion of control. She walked away thinking she had won, only to find that the prize was a poisoned chalice. People often think revenge is about rage, about fire and fury. But that's not true. Real revenge is patient. It's quiet. It waits in shadows, not with a knife, but with knowledge. I didn't destroy Cassandra. She did that all on her own. I simply gave her the space and the rope, and let her show the world exactly who she was. And in the end, that was far more satisfying than anything I could have shouted or screamed. So, what would you have done if someone you trusted stole everything you were owed? Would you walk away, or plan something smarter, quieter, and far more satisfying? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy true revenge stories with a twist, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss what's coming next.